So just to go back to the notion of material discursivity suggests that materials have agency beyond the human, that they're not waiting to be read or for humans to be act upon them. But this notion posits that materials do not exist as a static or inanimate object, but rather they are active in the shaping of worlds. And as Karen Barad writes, that matter matters. And so this deepens our conversation beyond human language and how place and materials have lives that are active in the making of discourses. And they're entangled in the production of worlds. They move, shift, and act and produce effects that humans often do not attend to, but regardless of our attention, they continue to respond and to shape place. They also shape our perceptions of place and our positionalities within them. So in your walks, you can pay attention to things beyond only the human, beyond only human verbal language as you worked through in your inquiry projects. And as we carry with us phenomenological orientation from the Van Manen text in attuning to this walk, we can also notice the phenomenological life of materials and place, how they're lived, and attending to the materiality of the world as composing and recomposing with us in the experience as well. So there are physical presences that generate particular ways of being and assumptions about the ways in which we're able to be in a place. And in your inquiry projects, you considered what particular objects generated in a living inquiry with others. So this idea that the things in the space and the place itself, the configuration of the place, does something. And this is in deep relation with how life is lived in that particular context. And so just to give an example, a while back I was listening to a podcast called The Cultures of Energy podcast, and feminist environmental humanities scholar Estrida Neymanis was being interviewed in this podcast. And I think her ideas are really generative as we think of our roles as teachers and researchers, and sort of this porosity of our lives in relation with place and with material. So in the podcast, the host shares a quote by Michel Serrault, who says that, quote, "The river does not bowl over or bowl along the stone, but rather the river is slowly percolating through the stone." So attending to the relationality of place and how things are always becoming, how might you think of these kind of relations and the qualities of these relations in your role as a teacher and a researcher? How, as educators, might we respond and nourish these kinds of relations and attention to what they do? So following Neymanis, we can ask what kind of imaginaries are required of us if we're to respond differently, to relate differently to this political moment and material livelihoods in the 21st century. So Neymanis studies water as material, and she speaks about water as an archive of feeling, as an archive that's constantly changing and becoming with others, like the example of the river. So water and materials in place hold memories of human desire in some way. They can be traced with our wants, a material archive of the ways in which we act. There's a remnants of chemicals, plastics, waste materials that water holds. And she speaks in this podcast to how very personal that is. How place and materials remember these effects, these actions, and they're sort of a physical manifestation of ways of being, of particular desires within 21st century advanced capitalism. And so in tracing these manifestations, both physically and symbolically, we can think about how as teachers and researchers, we're both accountable to and vulnerable to these effects. So thinking with this, we might consider this week in our walks an ethic of vulnerability, and how walking with the sense of being vulnerable, of being permeable with place and with materials, might also be a crucial disposition and orientation to our research and pedagogical work with children. And as Irwin, Triggs, and Lego consider, perhaps walking might be a beginning place to heighten a sense of involvement in our involvements. Walking that sensitizes bodies to feelings of being affected and of affecting something. So David Jardine writes that in order to know the world, we need to love it. And I think that this is particularly provocative in terms of thinking about research and pedagogy with young children, because I think that he's suggesting here that love is not necessarily like in the simplest sense of the word. It's not necessarily a love that is happy or always full of joy. And following the May article on lingering this week, perhaps it lingers in expressions that are both painful and pleasurable. This love is a deep and rich love because of its confusions, complexities, and contradictions, because of the tensions, a thickness in living a relation with multiple difference, their histories and intersections and difficulties. So thinking about how, as a teacher and a researcher, you inherit the histories of the place that you're situated and create relations with it that aren't necessarily always easy to swallow or easy to digest, but they require a sort of a grappling with. So what does this require of us? How do we avoid the abstraction and fragmentation of knowledges that make this kind of radical love impossible? How do we sustain an attention to phenomena that is in-depth, multifaceted, and contradictory, while maintaining that felt value for knowledge that's alive, that lingers, as May tells us this week, and that is situated with place, where time is not spent, but rather it's dwelled with in its nuances and in its contradictions. So in early childhood education, we're often pulled to focus on the developing child who acquires basic skills sort of outside of a moving world, outside of relations. And we focus often on pre-thought curriculum over situated pedagogy. And Van Manen asks us in the text, why this fear of pedagogy? And so following David Jardine, perhaps we can think of pedagogy as an invitation to the world in its rawness, where in paying attention and through the arts of noticing, as we've been practicing throughout the semester, we might be reminded of our relations so that they're not forgotten, but rather we're building knowledges with children in these moments of remembering, in the face of neoliberal structures that continually seek to extract and instrumentalize dynamic lives of a place in the pursuit of a particular economic livelihood. So this week we're going to think together about walking as a modest and sort of mundane invitation to begin, or not begin, but continue thinking about how we might understand lived experience as a teacher and as a researcher. And in the Triggs article this week, they write that seeing requires our bodies, not only a sole reliance on vision. It requires attention to what we already know in order to compose knowledges that push us somewhere different, somewhere more livable. So where these processes of inquiry are sort of a search for the poetry of the place, beyond the facts, beyond the previous assumptions, toward how something is lived, and the ephemeral qualities and the essences that are alive in that experience. So before you walk this week, I encourage you to take notes on how it is that the authors of this article, by Triggs, Irwin, and Lego, are orienting themselves in their walking practices. What are the dispositions they carry? How does this help them to pay attention to things beyond what they already know? And how might this orientation unsettle familiar ideas about what a place is and can become? So how can you be and become in this place? What are the languages of this place beyond only the visual that are spoken through materials in place? So try to stretch yourself in coming to know this place as if you don't already know it, making the strange familiar in a sense. So you're searching for the living language that's active here. So we're conceptualizing walking as an artistic thinking and as a practice that's entangled, where meaning is made in the doing and that research is an act of creation with the world in motion. So again, these practices are porous and moving with. So you're not necessarily thinking about this place or seeking to name the definitions of it, but rather you're seeking to orient yourself as part of, as with, as coming to know with. Where learning is a participation in the world. There's a co-compositional and a sort of co-evolutional essence to this. So we're situating this experience within the living system, where learning spaces here are co-constructed within the ecologies in which they're situated, and nothing happens in isolation. And so as you're walking, you can think about how this orientation to the withness of things, to the systems that are living here, might also be echoed in how you think about a classroom, in your role as an educator. So this is a methodology that is in response to an exchange of a set of relations, of flows and intensities, and situating the human within that materiality. So thinking again to this notion of relational aesthetics that we were introduced to in our readings of artography, we can think about how our encounters with the world and our interpretations of them generate thinking. So here an idea emerges and becomes meaningful through interactions and exchanges. It's meaningful because it's situated in the complex relations which it emerged. As soon as we fragment and try to dissolve something of its relational qualities, it becomes fragmented, it becomes surface and less complex, less rich, and less, maybe in some ways, full of the love that David Jardine was alluding to when ideas are maintained in their relations, in their homes almost. And so returning again to this idea of walking and engaging in encounters, we can think about ourselves as being open to be affected by the other in this sort of meeting place where there's a space between, and if each is open, then something might happen. An openness not to necessarily fully understand the other or to consume it into the same or a preconceived idea of what you already think it is, but rather to meet in a space of difference, of collision, of possible conflict, and to hover here in vulnerability, to be open to something as it's felt. There's an intimacy here in this form of knowledge making, a vulnerability and an accountability. And this sort of intimacy and vulnerability is dependent on the encounter with the other. It can't be done in isolation. This is why in your inquiry projects, this couldn't be something that's just written on your computer. It's dependent on a lived experience with another. It has a pedagogic sense in that it is done with others, and it is lived on the ground. So in this encounter, we're getting close to the other, we're attending to something in difference, where attention is sort of a devotion to understanding in its differentiality and reshaping and responding ourselves in the midst of that unknowability. So there are some propositions to think with as you engage in your portfolio this week. This again is thinking about what it means to situate our thinking in an encounter, walking with an intention to encounter place, to be open to becoming affected, bodily affected to what comes near, thinking about how knowledge might be generated through the sensations of your body as you encounter. engaging with the art of attention that we've been cultivating throughout this course, and noticing what it does to how you interpret phenomenon.